Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for Introduction to Psychology. In this lecture we will be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is social psychology. So what we're going to look at, and there's a long list of things because social psychology is such a broad field that we're going to kind of hit on a whole bunch of different things, and as much as we're going to hit on these different things, we're only going to cover maybe a third of the topics I would like to cover. I'm just trying to keep the amount of information down to a reasonable level, as well as the time down to a reasonable level. So we're going to look at social psychology, we're going to look at perceiving others, we're going to talk briefly about mate preferences, so we're not even talking about relationships, but we'll talk about mate preferences. We'll talk about schemas, attributions, conformity, obedience, helping, groups and crowds, social neuroscience, and we'll finish with aggression. And I wanted to talk about sexual assault, but I put the disclaimer on there. I'll even say it now, so when we get to that point you can avoid it, that none of the questions on the quiz will be from that. So if it's a topic that causes you distress, you do not need to pay any attention to it. I just think it is something good to talk about, not that it's a good topic, but it's something good to talk about so it is more understood, because the more we understand something, the more we can actually prevent it. So first we need to talk about, well, what is social psychology? And social psychology is a very broad field that's goals are basically to understand and explain why our thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and behaviors are influenced by social interactions. So by the presence of others, that's where you're going to get in groups, but also how we behave in groups. Humans are a very social species, and as a result, you're going to have a lot of our behavior determined based on that specific thing, that being that we are a social species. So let's get into a few of those things when it comes to social psychology. And one of the things that we look at, and this will be the first thing we look at, is how we perceive others. So the person perception, that's how we see people. We form impressions based on it. We make judgments about that person, all based on the way we view a person, how we see them. And this isn't just, when we talk about the person perception, we're not talking about just our first perception we have of someone, though first impressions are important, as we'll talk about in a minute. But we're also, when we're talking about the person perception, we're looking at our revised perceptions of people. So our person perception is essentially just our perceptions we have of other people, of other specific people, as well as, and we'll get to this when we get into stereotypes and things like that, as well as groups of people. And really, when we talk about the personal perception, we have to talk about physical appearance. A lot of our impressions we have on people are based on appearance. They're based on things like attractiveness, but also cleanliness, and what type of clothing the person is wearing, how the person holds themselves. So all of this physical appearance does have a big influence on how we perceive a person. If someone in a torn shirt, slightly torn, just looks like it's been worn too much, that's unshaven, and a guy who's unshaven, has long, just kind of scraggly hair, and he's wearing flip-flops, comes up to you and tells you he's a billionaire, are you likely to believe him? And the answer is no. If someone in a very crisp suit, very clean cut, holds themselves in a very domineering way, comes up to you and says they're a millionaire, are you likely to believe them? You're much more likely to believe them. That's because physical appearances matter. Because physical appearances are, and there's a term in evolutionary psychology, are an honest indicator. They're an honest indicator because someone who is trying to lie about something, someone who's trying to deceive, typically can't show the type of appearance, the outward indicators of having that social status and wealth and things like that. So physical appearance is very important in our person perceptions. So what goes on here? Well, our person perceptions influence behavior. The first impression that you make of someone will influence how you interact with them, and then as you revise your person perception, that will influence how you interact with them as well. So how we perceive people does affect how we interact with them. And when we look at things like race, which we'll come back to this in a little bit, but when we talk about prejudice and stereotypes and stuff like that, but one thing that should be pointed out is that we have a general sense in modern society of being able to recognize faces even of people who are from different ethnic backgrounds. However, we have it is also tends to be more difficult unless it's somebody you interact with regularly. The example I always give here is that I spent 15 months in Korea. When I first went there, I had difficulty telling the difference between someone who's Korean, someone who's Japanese, and someone who's Chinese. To me, the appearance of the three were very similar, and I could not differentiate them. By the end of my 15 months in Korea, I could completely differentiate, not with 100% accuracy because there is enough overlap, but with 95% accuracy, I could distinguish if someone was Japanese, Korean, or Chinese. And it's something I've lost since then because it's been years, and I still kind of can, I'm just not as good as I was, because familiarity lends towards being able to better distinguish features, especially features of someone who is different than yourself, appearance-wise. But at the same time, someone who maybe is a person with Asian ancestry who's adopted into a white family in the US and isn't around people with Asian ancestry, they will have just as much difficulty. So this isn't due to the race you are, the ethnicity you are, this is more due to exposure. And it's one of those reasons why, and we'll talk about this again when we talk about stereotypes, but why I recommend as much exposure to things that are different than yourself as you can get, because the more exposure you have, the better of a person you'll be, the more tolerant you'll be, and the more you'll be able to accurately understand other people. Now we talked about physical appearance, but I mentioned attractiveness. Attractiveness is an important concept of physical appearance. Why is that? Because people that are judged to be physically attractive are generally viewed more favorably. So people who are more viewed as more attractive tend to be viewed more favorably. And attractiveness, I don't like to just leave it at that. We're going to talk about mate preferences in the next two slides, but I don't like to just leave attractiveness at that. I should point out that attractiveness is subjective, yes, even though there are universal standards for attractiveness. And attractiveness is more related to things like facial symmetry in women. That is, how symmetrical the face is. If you put a mirror on one side of the face at one side and cut it off, does the other side match what's in the mirror? So how much does the two sides of the face match each other? That's what facial symmetry is. In guys, attractiveness is actually viewed less to do with physical appearance and more to do with characteristics such as dominance. So when I did my study, and I talked about it again at the beginning of the semester, and I had a Confederate that interacted with a couple. The female Confederates were chosen for their physical attractiveness. The male Confederates were chosen for their perceived dominance. That's because that's what's is more commonly accepted as the things that are viewed as more valued. Let's actually get into some of those when we're talking about mate preferences, because this kind of shows what people look for in general, not just in mates, or in romantic partners. I use the term mate with romantic partner interchangeably here, but with romantic partners, we look for specific things, but we also kind of look for some of these same things in our friendships, in our acquaintances, stuff like that, just not to the same extent. Okay, long list of things here. Women's mate preferences are for men who, the top one, the number one, is good financial prospects. That is ability to gain resources. Resources they have and ability to gain resources. This is evolutionary. This and the next slide are both heavily evolutionary. I talked about it earlier in the semester. Anytime you talk about reproduction, and when you're talking about romantic partners, you're in a sense talking about who you're going to reproduce with. So, at least evolutionary history-wise. When we're talking about reproduction, we need to look at, well, what evolution selected for it. So the number one thing that women look for in men, whether consciously or not, is good financial prospects. Do they have a job? Do they have the ability to get a job? Do they have the ability to gain resources? Do they have resources? That type of thing. That is because, at least evolution in the past, not necessarily today, but in the past, men were the resource providers. Women were the nurturers. Then they were the ones who had children and nurtured them. Men were the ones that provided resources for the family unit. Next highest is high social status, and again, this one goes back to the good financial prospects, because those that are higher social status tend to have higher financial prospects. Slightly older also goes back to good financial prospects, because those that are older tend to have better financial prospects. Why not much older? Why don't women prefer guys that are way older, the ones that have really good financial prospects, good resources? Well, that comes down to death and dying. If the guy dies before the kids are of age, then even if the guy had good resources then, doesn't necessarily mean good resources in the future. Ambitious, industrious, dependable, stable, all of these go back to good financial prospects, as well as dependable and stable, not causing harm to the partner. Displays love and commitment. So this is a big one in mate retention. So if a guy doesn't show love and commitment, he's a guy that might be just looking for a one-night stand, just short-term mating. Similarity. This is an interesting one. There's a bit of physical similarity here, but there's still incest taboos. But women and guys too, both of them are this case. They look for people who are more like themselves, because they're more likely to get along. They're more likely to agree on decisions, stuff like that. Sense of humor. And then down here I have our masculine, which was the one thing your book talks about, and our healthy. The masculine is actually one of the lowest things. It's still valued, because those of higher masculinity tend to have higher social status, tend to have better prospects, tend to be able to protect the family unit better, things like that. But too high a masculinity can actually be a problem, because men who are too masculine tend to be aggressive, and this can cause harm to the partner. And then the final one is that they're healthy, and I put here, how is this determined? Well, this is determined, you can't tell a person's health just by like, well, how healthy are you? No, health is determined by things like masculinity. People who are unhealthy tend to be are less able to show masculinity. Physical prowess, things like that are unable to be shown when someone is unhealthy, when someone is prone to diseases and things like that. So those are the types of things that are looked for. The masculinity, strength, height, stuff like that are good indicators of health. So those are what is looked for. Why is healthy important? Well, healthy is important because that person is the person that's healthier is more likely to live longer, but also this is reproduction we're talking about. So healthy means that they will pass on their genes for health to their offspring, to their children. What do men look for in women? Well, this one's a little bit shorter. We don't have much to talk about here, because whereas women are looking for men to be providers, they're looking for signs of commitment so that the guy won't leave. They're looking for signs of health for reproductive. One of the things that didn't go into in this class, but if you took something like human sexuality, would go into much more, and that is that there is a, basically there's a difference in investment between men and women in reproduction. Women, on one hand, can only reproduce, in humans, only reproduce once every about 11 months. They get pregnant, they're pregnant for 9 months, and it's really at a minimum, and even throughout most of our evolutionary history, women didn't start having another kid until the first one was 2 to 3 years old. So because while you're breastfeeding, you're less likely to get pregnant. So as a result, what occurred was that women, and we can look throughout evolutionary history even before humans, that the female of a species has a greater initial investment. That is, that they can only get pregnant so often, and they can only have so many offspring. Men, on the other hand, since they're not the ones getting pregnant, could have no theoretical upper limit to the amount of offspring they can have. That is because they could mate with one person, then mate with another, then mate with another, then mate with another, getting each of them pregnant. So women have a lot to look for in guys because they're looking for something that'll go along with that initial large investment. I'm dumbing it down, I'm simplifying it here. Like I said, human sexuality and bio, will talk about it in some bio classes, but it's dumbed down to women or females of a species are more selective, they're more choosy when it comes to who they will reproduce with. And humans, that means who they'll be romantic partners with, because of that larger initial investment. Men have a very small initial investment. They are much less choosy when it comes to choosing a partner. Well, how does this result then? Well, we had that long list of things that women look for in men. Men basically prefer women who have high reproductive value. That is where their choosiness comes in. They prefer, and that we get to the question here, just like, well, how is health measured in men? How is reproductive value measured in women? It's not something that's on their head. One of the preferences here is age, of reproductive age, but younger. Well, again, that's not written on the heads. In human sexuality, I have a very interesting slide where I show 3 women, the celebrities, like Angelina Jolie, that are, Jennifer Lopez is another one, that are in their 50s that look like they're 25, 30. So age is not something that can be directly determined. So what is then used as a determinant? Well, that's where the physical beauty and body shape come in. So that's what men look for mainly in women. Now, men look for other things as well, especially in humans. We're a social species, so there's more to consider there. Similarity comes to mind, dependable, other things like that. The point is men are less choosy, and it really comes down to male preferences are about that physical beauty and body-shaped hourglass figure that you see in the picture here. And why is that the case? Because our women who have that 0.7 waist to hip ratio, waist to hip, so you've got your waist here and your hips here. Let me even draw that out farther. Women that have a 0.7 waist to hip ratio, meaning their waist is 7/10 as big or 70% as big as their hips, what repeated studies have found is they're most likely to get pregnant, and they're most likely to successfully carry a fetus to term. So because of that, they're most likely to be able to successfully reproduce. So that's where things like that come in. So in All of this, as I said, if you want to know more, I could talk about this all day long. I've already spent way too much time on these 2 slides. I could talk about this all day long, but human sexuality is a fantastic class for this. I really recommend it. Okay, let's change gears. And now we're going to talk about something I talked about a little bit the last few weeks, and that is schemas and scripts. Why did I say schemas and scripts? A cognitive psych idea for social psych? Well, that's because schemas and scripts are mainly a social thing. Now, schemas aren't necessarily just social. They're going to be any mental representation we have of the world. So a schema is a mental category that we have about the world. It's about people, it's about events, it's about concepts, it's about objects, and it really influences, it dictates how we view and interact with the world. We have a schema for dogs. Our schema for dogs that they have 4 legs, but a good, interesting aside from schemas is schemas are manipulatable. So we have a schema for dogs that they have 4 legs, but if we see a dog with 3 legs, we're not going to say it's not a dog because it doesn't have 4 legs. We're just going to deem it a 3-legged dog. So we have schemas for dogs that include 4 legs, a tail, even if sometimes they don't, that they're furry, even if sometimes they're not, that they are of specific size ranges, of specific shapes, stuff like that. So our schemas are our mental representation we have of the different things in the world. We form schemas, though, about people, and that's where it comes into social psychology. We form schemas about people. We form schemas about individual people, and we form schemas about groups of people. So this is where things like, and we're going to talk about this in the next slide, but where bias can come in. It can actually distort our thoughts. It can distort the way we look at people. It can distort the way we perceive people, and it can distort our behaviors as a result, sometimes in very negative ways. The last thing I'll talk about here before we get to the next slide is, and your book talks about different types of schemas. There's 4 different main types of schemas. One of the types of schemas, though, that I'm not even going to go into the other ones. I just, it doesn't need to be gone into. But I do want to talk about scripts real quick, just briefly, because schemas are scripts are a important subcategory of schemas, and that is scripts are essentially organized ways of thinking about doing or going through activities, events, or procedures. So you have a script for, let's say, how to study for an exam. You have a script for how to cook dinner. You have a script for how to drive to work or to school, that type of thing. So scripts are these essentially procedures, activities, events that we have a organized way of thinking about. And scripts can actually cause us to make mistakes. If you ask about, well, what is the method for cooking something, and you have a script that says you must do this, 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 and this, and this. If you try and add something new to it, you sometimes will forget to do it. Other times you might add the new thing and then later forget that you added the new thing. That's because your script is dictating your memory, stuff like that. So scripts, again, good and bad. Schemas, good and bad. We'll actually look at the advantages and disadvantages. But before we get to that, let's actually talk about some of the big things in schemas that have big influences on some things in very negative ways. And that is stereotypes. So stereotypes are widely held beliefs that people have certain traits because they belong to a particular group. Stereotypes are sometimes accurate. Why do I say that? Because stereotypes aren't all negative. Sometimes they're inaccurate, though. Typically the ones that we view as negative in others. Well, what's going on here? Why do we have these stereotypes? Why do they continue in our brain? We have stereotypes because our brains are not as efficient as we would like. Our brains are not as quick. They're not as good as we would like. Our brains actually take lots of shortcuts. And one of the shortcuts we take is that we form stereotypes about groups of people because of prior interactions or prior times we've seen individuals from that group as a method for, if we interact with someone else from that group, our mind is quickly able to make assessments. And this works in positive and negative ways. But what affects stereotypes here? Well, again, like I said, previous interactions, but also television affects stereotypes. The media affects stereotypes. What other people have told you affects stereotypes. And again, like I said, stereotypes, we now view the word stereotype as a bad word. But stereotype is itself does not itself mean bad. So, like I said, some stereotypes are good. Some stereotypes, like the stereotype that some individuals, like Asian descent individuals, are better at math. So that stereotype isn't necessarily negative. I'm not saying it's accurate, but it's something that's not necessarily bad. However, other stereotypes are definitely very bad and lead to things like prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice is unfair, biased, or intolerant attitudes towards another group of people. Negative stereotypes can lead to prejudice. A stereotype that a group is violent can lead to prejudice. And then negative stereotypes and prejudice can lead to discrimination, where you behave in a way towards a member of another group that is negative, that is basically denies them equality. And we've got a lot of that going on in the world. It's a very interesting time to talk about things like stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination because of everything going on, when we see how much of a negative things like prejudice and discrimination can be. And people have understood for a long time, but throughout much of human evolutionary history, that discrimination and prejudice can be bad. And we are constantly shifting towards reducing that. And this is where, like I've said before, and I'll say it again, I even said it in this set of slides, the single biggest thing I can recommend to anyone to reduce negative stereotypes, to reduce prejudice, and to reduce discrimination is to experience the world, to experience others. I don't know if I said this in this class before, but I come from a racist background. I grew up in a farming small town. My grandparents were racist. My mom is less racist, but still racist. I went to school with people that were racist. I, at the time, believed I was above it all and I was not racist like they were. I came to realize as I got older, though, that even the thinking I was that I wasn't racist was that I was still racist, I was just less racist. And really what opened my eyes, what allowed me to reduce that, is I went in the military. And the military is about 50% minority, large percentage of African American, large percentage of Hispanic, from various different regions, including Puerto Rico. And it basically allowed me to interact with people and for me to come to the understanding that my stereotypes that I had been raised to have, my negative stereotypes that resulted in this prejudice and discrimination, were inaccurate. And that through exposure, I was able to get beyond that basically way that I was raised. So it's really one of those things I just really, really recommend getting out and exposing yourself to people from other cultures, to people from other ethnic or racial backgrounds, to people from other groups. The more you get out of your own in-group into more out-groups, the less you will engage in these types of negative stereotypes that lead to the prejudice and discrimination. Okay, very serious talk there, but let's look at schemas' advantages and disadvantages. So the disadvantages: schemas may restrict, bias, or distort what we attend to, what we remember, may cause us to treat people in ways that they shouldn't be treated. And schemas are actually very resistant to change because we generally attend to information that supports our worldview, our schema, and deny information that's inconsistent with it. This is what's called confirmation bias. I don't think we talked about confirmation bias this semester, but confirmation bias is a bias where you basically notice and remember things that support your opinion, support your worldview, or support what it is you're thinking about or considering, and you don't notice things that discourage it. And this actually causes a lot of intergroup conflict because of the two sides perceiving the same thing entirely differently due to both sides using confirmation bias. On the other hand, there's some very big advantages to schemas. It contains information about how people think and behave. It can help you analyze and respond appropriately to a particular situation in an expedient manner. As I said before, our minds are not a supercomputer. Our minds do not process all of the information in our environment. They do not work as fast as we'd like. Schemas allow us to basically take shortcuts to analyze situations quicker. And they do provide guidelines for how to behave in various social events and help us explain the social behaviors of others. Next thing we're going to talk about is attributions. And basically attributions, we talked about it a little bit already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. And that is, attributions basically look at causes of people's behaviors. What do we attribute the cause of our own behavior and other people's behaviors? The two types of attributions we do are internal attributions. This is where we explain behavior based on the internal characteristics or dispositions of the person performing the behavior. So an internal attribution is based on what's going on inside. External attributions are basically attributions that about behavior related to external. So if someone's in a situation where they get angry, an internal attribution of them getting angry would be because they can't control their anger. An external attribution might be that they were provoked. So there's two different attributions going on there, that internal and external, for the same behavior. One relates to the internal of the person, the individual. The other is to the external situation that's affecting the person. One thing when we do attributions, we have some errors that occur. First error is what's called the first and most important error actually, is what's called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is where we look at other people, especially when we determine that their disposition, their personality traits, all of that, we determine that to be what causes behavior rather than the situation. So the fundamental attribution error is where we look at internal, mainly, causes for other people's negative behaviors. When you see someone, let's say in a sport, who throws a punch, we don't look at the situation typically. We just look at the internal, and that they had no self-control. So the fundamental attribution error is when we basically look at other people and we blame their negative behaviors especially on their internal and not on their situation. The other side of it is the actor-observer effect, and that is where we tend to attribute our own behavior, especially negative behavior, specifically, to situational factors. So if, and this is something that, and again, we can look at society and see how big of a issue the society as it's happening right now around us, how big of an issue this is, and how if someone else does something and we do the exact same thing, two people, someone else and us doing the exact same thing, we tend to explain off the other person's behavior as an internal lack of control, something like that. We explain off our own behavior as something that happened to us. We were not in control. So it's a bias that we have. The actor-observer effect and fundamental attribution error are two basically complementary biases that we have for looking at behavior of individuals, specifically negative behavior. And then as far as positive behavior, as well as negative too, we explain our successes by looking at them as our own dispositions. We were able to succeed at something, we were able to do well on a test because of internal ability, whereas failures are due to the situation. And I had talked about this before. Let's shift gears. Now we're going to talk about social and group influences. The first thing I'm going to talk about here is conformity. I'm not going to talk about it too much because the next video is very fantastic for it. The few videos that are in these slides, I really recommend watching them all the way through. They are very excellent. Actually, there's two videos coming up after this slide that will look at conformity. So conformity is any behavior that you perform because of group pressure, even though that pressure might not involve direct requests. So what you see here and what you're going to see in the video on the next slide is the Ash experiments, where there was two lines. There was a line in one picture and then three different lines in another picture, and you had to say, well, what line in the second picture is the same length as the line in the first picture? And you look at this one here, and it looks like 2 is the same length that you have. So this one here is the same length as this one. However, in the Ash experiments, there was a bunch of people sitting together. Only one of them was actually was a participant in the experiment. Everyone else was Confederates. And they might be, like in the picture you see here, the 7th person in line. And now they're asked in order which line looks like this line. And the person 1 goes, and they say 1. Person 2 goes, and they say 1. Person 3 goes, they say 1. Person 4, 5, 6 goes, they all say 1. Even though you can clearly see it's not the same as 1. Person 7 comes up, and quite often, even though they know in their mind that it looks more like 2, they are more likely to say 1 because that's what everybody else said. So watch that video. Watch both of these videos, because the other one's second video is from a comedy show. Can't remember what it is right now, but it's from a comedy show, basically looking at conformity. Just as I said, watch those videos. Recommend it.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are Confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2.
2.
2.
2.
2. 3. 3.
3. 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2. 2.
2.
2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1.
1.
2. 1.
2.
2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing
2.
with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2.
2.
2.
2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1. 2.
1.
2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1.
1.
1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice They take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
Okay, like I said, those videos really interesting. I can't talk enough about how those videos just really have shaped a lot of modern social psychology and looking at conformity and how people conform to the group around them, even when they know they're wrong. And a lot of it has to do, as one of those videos said, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have this desire to fit in. It's a subconscious desire, but we have a desire to fit in. A couple other things relating to this: compliance. So compliance is a kind of conformity in which we give into social pressure in our public responses, but do not change our private beliefs. So we might comply, but we still disagree. Foot in the door technique is another. Hold on. Foot in the door technique is another thing relating to this, where someone will start with a small request and then to get compliance, and then get a bigger request and a bigger request and a bigger request, because it works with one of our cognitive principles, that is, it's the sunk cost fallacy. That is, we've already done one thing, one more thing, something slightly bigger won't be, it's not that detrimental because we've already, or it's not as big of a deal because we've already done a lot. Sunk cost fallacy also works with gambling, but it works here in that because we've already done one thing, we are more likely to do the next because we believe that it's not as big of a deal now that we've already done the one. And then the final one is obedience. This is where we perform a behavior in response to orders given by someone in a position of power or authority. And obedience is one that again comes back to what we're looking at in what's going on in society today. And we might think that obedience is not something that should be blindly followed, and I would agree with that. However, their social psychology says there's way more to it than that. That is, that even the I was just following orders argument, I'm not defending the people who say that, but I will say that social psychology has determined that quite often a reasonable person would go along with orders that are unreasonable. In the next slide, there's a video where you'll see Milgram's experiment, but Milgram's experiment was where basically there was a experimenter who was giving commands to a subject, and the commands to the subject were and the only commands that the experimenter was giving was basically the experiment must continue, you must continue. Something along those lines. That's the only orders that were given. And the subject then was basically, and you'll see it in the video, was testing the fake test subject. And when the fake test subject got things wrong, the subject of the experiment was supposed to shock them. And the shocks got successively worse to the point where the shocks were labeled as deadly. And as you'll see in the video, the thing is the majority of people would go all the way to the deadly shocks when told to by someone in authority.
In a unique period from the early 60s to the early 70s, a group of social scientists conducted a series of experiments examining the nature of human behavior and its relationship to social conventions and situations.
In this setting, I allow things to be done to me that I wouldn't allow in any other context. The dentist is about to put an electric drill into my mouth. In this setting, I willingly expose my throat to a man with a razor blade.
Stanley Milgram, one of the most influential social psychologists of the time, was particularly fascinated with the dangers of group behavior and blind obedience to authority.
What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever, so that he can act inhumanely, harshly, severely, and in no way limited by feelings of compassion or conscience. These are questions for me.
But he might be dead in there. The experiment requires that you continue teaching. 330 volts.
The experiments that Milgram and others conducted were controversial, and for ethical reasons may never be conducted again. Yet the results of those experiments remain groundbreaking, profoundly revealing about the tensions between the individual and society, and increasingly relevant to contemporary life. In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable, how the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was in the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is to a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As
as far as is necessary.
What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function, but he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You got no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim. You don't know.
Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most subjects, found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically, inappropriately.
150 volts.
It's 4 minutes. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which was created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
As his voice began to show increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation. You put them in the situation.
Wrong. I want the 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
Next was slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the chalkboard.
450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau. A death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram get today if he were to do the experiment today?
Probably about the same.
Probably about the same. Why?
I don't know. I think people are just inherently obedient.
It just really shows how far human beings will go to appease what they perceive to be an authority figure.
Milgram has identified one of the constants, one of the universals of social behavior. The readiness to obey authority cuts across time. It's a constant. The other outstanding and distinctive thing about the obedience experiment is how much it has and keeps on permeating contemporary culture and thought. It's still with us in very, very important ways.
So again, before I get to this slide, that on that video just is really interesting, and it really should make us question in ways a lot of the way we perceive others' behavior. When people are just following orders, and following orders appears to be a natural human thing to do, when people are just following orders, even doing unethical things, I'm not saying they should be absolved of responsibility. There definitely needs to be responsibility there. But the person who's giving the orders should be held responsible as well, if not even held more responsible. And you see this with what's going on now, where certain officers are being arrested justifiably so for their actions. But who is not getting arrested? The people that train them, the people that gave them orders to do these types of things. So we really should look beyond just the people that are following orders into the people that are giving orders as well. Okay, now on to something way more positive, and that is helping and prosocial behavior. And I'm going to take something that's way more positive and actually take a little bit away from it, but we'll get to that in a minute. So helping is any behavior that benefits others and has a positive social consequence. We view this as, or we have a term for this as altruism. That's the form of helping or doing something, often at a cost of risk, for reasons other than expectations of a material or social reward. And here's where I'm going to say, true altruism is either extremely rare or doesn't exist at all. Yes, so I took this positive and I'm making it negative. Hate to twist that like that, but true altruism doesn't exist. Or if it does exist, it is rare. Why is that the case? Because true altruism is selected against evolutionarily. Why? Because doing something specifically for others without any reward to the self, with just a cost to the self, is detrimental evolutionarily. It would be selected against. That doesn't mean people don't help. That just means true altruism doesn't exist. Let's get on to the next slide where we'll actually look at this a little bit more. We do have, as humans, empathy. We empathize with what others are going through. We have personal distress when we see others in need. We also have societal norms and values that dictate that we should help others in need. So how do we resolve this with altruism? How does these things that lend us towards or push us towards helping lend towards altruism? And that is that it's not true altruism, it's what's called reciprocal altruism. We do things to benefit others in order to gain a benefit. And it's very important to note that the benefit we gain from reciprocal altruism does not need to be something we are consciously going for or even are consciously aware of. Reciprocal altruism talks about a benefit to the self that is something that comes back as a benefit to the self, at least typically on average, when we do things of helping others. The example is that if we help others, even if that person doesn't help us back, maybe we get raised in social status because others are seeing we helped others. So since other people see we helped others, we're more likely to get helped ourselves. And we actually see this in many different species. Comparative psychology looks at similarities between humans and other species. When we look at reciprocal altruism in vampire bats is a perfect example. That is, vampire bats, they go out hunting for blood. They need so much blood each day to survive. They need to feed within every 2 to 3 days or they will die. Bats that go out and basically find food will drink too much and come back and share it with those who didn't. What's been found is that then that's a sense of altruism. They're helping those who didn't find food. But what's actually been found is that those bats that help others are more likely to be helped themselves, even by other bats than the ones they helped. So that's where the reciprocal altruism comes in. I'm not going to say that reciprocal altruism is bad. I don't think reciprocal altruism is bad. I think that reciprocal altruism gets us to be better people in society. It leads us to doing things to help others. I strongly encourage the helping of others and the helping people, especially those who are less fortunate. And really here, if you can do it without any reward to yourself, then great. Usually people get a sense of achievement by helping others. So there's a raise in subjective well-being So again, that's a reciprocal altruism type thing because you're gaining a benefit. There's all kinds of other things. You don't even need to gain a benefit yourself. I'm very much in favor of helping and service and all of those types of things. At the same time, I understand from a psychological evolutionary perspective that the majority of helping done is actually reciprocal altruism. As far as helping though, why do people help? Well, there's what's called the decision stage model of helping, and helping occurs basically in a 5-stage thing. First stage, you notice the situation. Second stage, you interpret it as one in which help is needed. Third, and this is the important one, assuming personal responsibility. Fourth is where you choose the form of assistance. And then 5 is where you actually carry out the assistance. And as I said, that number 3 is a big one, and we're going to start talking about groups next and looking at how groups affect this. But groups actually affect decision making in a way that can be decision making for helping can be detrimental. And then finally, there's the arousal cost reward model of helping, and this kind of comes into going back to that altruism and all of that. How much of a cost is it to help others, and how much of a reward is it to help others? And this is situation specific. If there's a burning building, what is the cost of running into that burning building to save someone? That cost can be pretty severe because you can die from it. What is the reward from it? You save a life. That is a big reward in of itself. But there are other rewards beyond that. So each time there's a decision to help others, people make this instantaneous arousal cost reward analysis. And this kind of goes back to the reciprocal altruism and looking at that from this perspective of when do we help. I said I'd get into groups. I'm going to go through some of this relatively quick. So a group, what is a group? 2 or more people that share some common idea, goal, or purpose. Group cohesion is a sense of togetherness, and it's determined by how much the group perceives they share these common attributes. And common attributes, again, doesn't have to be anything physical. It can definitely be things like psychological or the goal, shared goal, things like that. There tends to be high group cohesion when you get things like sports. So in there, you're not talking about the physical characteristics. You're talking more about that group cohesion because you're sharing the goal of achieving success at your sport. We also have group norms. Each group has their own norms. And these are both formal and informal rules about how members should behave. And then finally, we've got social comparison theory here, where we're driven to compare ourselves to others who are similar to us. So in this way, we determine the correctness of our attitudes and beliefs. Well, this can be good because it can reaffirm positive attitudes and beliefs, but it can be bad because it can also reinforce negative attitudes and beliefs. And you see this in groups, the hate groups and things like that, where these negative attitudes and beliefs just get reinforced. And again, this goes back to what I talked about earlier. Well, what's the best way to get out of this? It is to be more inclusive, to experience more of the world. If we're comparing ourselves to others that are in our group, then if you widen your group, then you're more likely to widen your worldview. So, and this, again, another thing that's relating to what's going on now. So a crowd is a large group of people who typically are strangers that can facilitate or inhibit behaviors, and quite often in negative ways. One of the things that occurs here is the de-individualization that occurs in crowds. That is because we are more likely to be anonymous, less likely to be personally identified, we tend to be more likely to do illegal things, do things that we wouldn't normally do. And that's where you get things like the rioting going on and other aggressive acts that occur in crowds.
Diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when people who need to make a decision wait for someone else to act instead. The more people involved, the more likely it is that each person will do nothing, believing someone else from the group will probably respond. Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané set up an experiment where a distress call made it appear that a person nearby had suffered an injury. When subjects heard the cry and thought they were the only ones who heard it, 85% of them helped. But if subjects thought there was another person who heard the call too, only 62% helped. And if subjects thought that 4 other people also heard the cry for help, just 31% took action. Diffusion of responsibility makes people feel less pressure to act because they believe, correctly or incorrectly, that someone else will do so. And when we don't feel responsible for a situation, we feel less guilty when we do nothing to help. So, in this way, diffusion of responsibility keeps us from paying attention to our own conscience.
That last video did a real good job explaining things like diffusion of responsibility. So relating to that, the bystander effect. That is, the bystander effect is just in general, this isn't the helping effect, but the bystander effect is where an individual may feel inhibited from taking specific actions, whether good actions, bad actions, whatever actions, because of the presence of others, because others are around. But this gets us into things like informational influence theory, where we use the reactions of others to judge the seriousness of a situation. So if others don't see a situation as serious, we don't see it as serious. And if others see a situation as overly serious, we may see it as overly serious. And then what the video talked about, this diffusion of responsibility, where in the presence of others, we feel less personal responsibility and are less likely to take action even if help is needed. Now, there are things that come in with diffusion of responsibility theory that should be taken into account. People who have experience or are experts in something like helping are more likely to ignore diffusion of responsibility theory. So if you have a nurse, an EMT, a doctor, something like that, someone who actually has knowledge on the subject, they are not likely to be affected by the diffusion of responsibility. But people who are not experts, who don't know what these types of things, they are more likely to be affected. So it's really, there's more going on, like much of social psychology, there's more going on than it first seems, and you have to kind of look into these other things as well. 2 more things that come into groups that actually have negative consequences. The first is what's called group polarization, and this is where a group basically will reinforce a majority's point of view and actually shift a view to more extreme. And you see this quite often in things like politics, where the group will become more and more polarized, especially if you've got an in-group versus out-group, because you want to distinguish yourself from the other group. So the group starts to take on views that are even more extreme than they had before they became a group. And the final is groupthink, and this is where a group will make bad decisions because it's more concerned with reaching agreement and sticking together. This is where conformity comes in, than with considering all of the alternatives. What's actually been found is that if your group is too big for when it comes to decision making, your group actually tends to make bad decisions rather than good decisions. So when it comes to a decision making group, and especially in a business context, it's better to keep the group smaller. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is social neuroscience. One of my favorites. I told you before, even though my PhD is in one specific thing, the best term to describe me is that I am a developmental social neuroendocrinologist. What does that come down to? That just comes down to the fact that I look at things like the biological side of human functioning and how that affects social interactions. So how does social behavior influence the brain, and how does the brain influence social behavior? So I look at things like testosterone and other hormones and how they affect behavior. So social neuroscience, social neuroendocrinology is basically looking at how these bodily processes, how the brain, how the different neurotransmitters affect how we act, think, and behave. Not going to go into that too much right now, but I will talk about one thing that we've already talked about, and that is mirror neurons. So we talked about mirror neurons before, but what is going on here? And that is the mirror neurons are again in the brain. They activate in reaction to seeing other people do stuff. Well, they also have a strong impact on empathy. And they are especially activated when we observe people from our in-group, and not as activated when we observe people from our out-group. And what it comes down to here is because these mirror neurons are firing and activating empathy, it actually engages things like helping and stuff like that. Anytime we talk about social psych, we need to talk about aggression. So from here on out, we're going to talk about aggression, and then we're going to get to that topic that I said you can end the slides early if you want to. When we get to that, I'll say that again. So aggression. Aggression is any behavior directed towards another that's intended to cause harm. The social cognitive theory of aggression is much of human behavior, including aggression, is learned through things like watching, imitating, modeling, and it doesn't require the observer to receive any reward. Now, there's more to it than that. There's the fact that we, as humans and most animals, have aggression. We use aggression to get what we want. We use aggression to achieve our goals. We use aggression to raise our social status, things like that. However, most of that is in our evolutionary past. In our modern society, aggression is something that is against social norms. It is frowned on. So because of it, we are changing as a society and becoming less aggressive. This doesn't change the fact that we still have aggressive tendencies, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So what causes aggression? First is situational clues. And this is one of the big things when it comes to causes of aggression we look at is the frustration aggression hypothesis. And this is when we are blocked from our goals, we become frustrated and respond with anger and aggression. So whatever our goal is, if we're blocked from it, we become aggressive. And as I said, one of the things in the past is people, even when not blocked from goals, used aggression to achieve goals. But in our modern society, that's much less likely, which is why we now have the modified frustration aggression hypothesis, and that is, although frustration might lead to aggression, we do as humans have personal cognitive factors that can override the aggressive response. Different people react to the environment differently when it comes to provoked aggression. When you look at people in the past, they were more likely to react to provoked aggression than we are today. And a lot of this comes down to societal norms, and as well as being able to control it. That being said, depending on the situation, it becomes more and more difficult even in our modern environment. The final thing I want to talk about relating to aggression is unchecked aggression. And this just comes back to, again, a lot of this we've been talking about in these slides come back to where we are today and what's going on in the world today. And really what comes from unchecked aggression is even though as a society we've become less aggressive. The Steven Pinker, an evolutionary biologist, has a very, actually I think he's, that's irrelevant. The point is Steven Pinker has a very fantastic book on this topic. It's called Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And that is showing that violence in the world has declined pretty consistently throughout the last 200 to 500 years. Throughout the at least last 300 to 500 years. So violence has declined and it continues to decline. We see on the news today there's lots of violence out there, but even then that is way less than there used to be. So on average violence is declining. And one of the reasons of that is because as a society our cultural norms discourage aggression, discourage violence, discourage capital punishment, those types of things. 500 years ago, even 200-300 years ago, it would have been common to go for the public to get together to watch a public execution. Just the idea of, in our modern society, having a public execution really is anxiety-inducing, because we have shifted what is normal. We have shifted the cultural norms. However, that being said, even though we've shifted it and violence has declined, there are some instances of unchecked aggression. Those individuals who don't have the same norms, the same societal norms, because there isn't the same checks and balances on their aggression. There isn't the same negative outcomes for being aggressive. Specifically, like we look at today, the police. What's their punishment typically for being aggressive? If there's any punishment at all, it tends to be things like paid leave, sometimes unpaid leave, sometimes fired, and then they're hired in at another police department. Hopefully, and that's a good thing that's going on with the protests, hopefully we get to a point where the checks and balances are put in place so that that unchecked aggression, unchecked violence is reduced. I'm not going to talk about it more now. I think you can just watch the news and see all of this. I just wanted to incorporate this in so we can see that, and at the same time pointing out that violence in the world has declined. It's obviously not gone. It's obviously not it could obviously get better, but it still has declined, and hopefully with what's going on right now, it gets even better. Okay, this last topic, as the note says at the top, and as I said earlier, there will be no questions from this topic on the quiz. I do want to talk about it. It is important to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. We just got done talking about aggression. That makes me uncomfortable, but still needed to talk about it. Rape definitely makes me feel uncomfortable to talk about even. But that being said, it is still something that needs to be discussed. Why does it need to be discussed? It doesn't need to be discussed because the people who are researching it, that are discussing it, are for it. It needs to be discussed because the more we understand it, the better we can reduce the incidence of it. And before I get in too far, I'm going to talk about, so this is the point where if this makes you uncomfortable, you can stop here. That being said, this one of the disclaimers I always give when I'm talking about this, and that is, we have this perception, people have this unfortunate perception that people who do research on rape are for rape, and I kind of just said that a minute ago, but it's the people who are researching rape are pro-rape, and my response to that is always, And anybody's response should be, do the people who research cancer, are they pro-cancer? Are the people that are researching heart disease, are they pro-heart disease? Are the people who research murder pro-murder? No. So when we get to two very sensitive topics, the first being rape and the second being, and we're not going to talk about it in here, I did not include it in these slides, but the second is molestation. When people do research on those, unfortunately, those researchers typically get accused of being pro those topics or being people who engage in those acts. And I just have to point out that that's absurd, just like the absurdity of saying someone who's pro-cancer is all about giving people cancer. They are researched because it is, like other areas, it is important to know why things occur, when they occur, how they occur, what is the mechanisms going into when they occur, so that we can reduce them. The person that's researching cancer is researching it so that they can better understand cancer, so that they can better treat and reduce incidence of cancer. The people who research rape are researching rape so that we can better understand it and reduce or eliminate rape. That being said, let's get into this now. So rape, it's going to be any kind of penetration of another person, regardless of gender, without the victim's consent. The last thing I'll say about molestation here is children can't give consent, so that's why it is counted in this, but I am not going to include it in any of the discussion here. I talk about it in human sexuality if you're interested in more, but I just didn't feel it was appropriate to include here. We're going to look at first we'll look at the characteristics and kinds of rape. And this is one where I'll come back to this a few times, but first off, this first one, power rape. Rape for power, rape for control, that type of thing. Your book is 100% incorrect. I can't say that strongly enough. Your book, when it says that this is the majority of rapes, basically doesn't consider any of the research that's been done in the field. It's actually fewer than 2% of all rapes are actually due to power or control. Sadistic rape, we know that fewer than 1% of all rapes are sadistic rape. Sadistic rape is where the rapist is intentionally out to harm the person he's raping. What we know about sadistic rapists is they're people that enjoy harming others in ways other than rape. They just rape as part of their one of the things they do to cause harm to others. So sadistic rapists are people who get aroused, get off on, and enjoy causing harm in general, which includes rape. And then finally, rape for sex. Your book doesn't talk about this, but rape for sex, the reason rape occurs is for sex, is about 97% of all rapes. And the research actually shows that this is true. I'll come back to this in a little bit, but just note that the numbers that your book published, the numbers that your book says if you read the book, are basically looking at the numbers that essentially pop culture looks at as the numbers and the reasons for rape, and not what the actual science says. The actual science says the numbers that I have here. What about types of sexual assault? And again, I excluded the one of including children here, but the types of sexual assault that are done on adults. Stranger sexual assault, this is the one we are taught to fear. This is the one we're taught to that occurs often. In actuality, stranger sexual assault is relatively rare when you're talking actual rape. If you include in things like touching, groping, things like that, then the numbers get much higher, because you have people who will do it on like the subway and crowded places. But as far as actual rape, not just the sexual assault violations and actual penetration, stranger rape is relatively rare. Acquaintance sexual assault is the most common, an acquaintance here is going to be a very broad definition of acquaintance. Acquaintance could be someone you kind of know, to someone that you're friends with, to someone you're on a date with, that type of thing. Date rape is the most common type of rape, by far. And that is where basically the date turns into the rape. Other types as well, multiple perpetrators like gang rapes. This usually involves things like indoctrinations or going along with the group. Sexual assault of men, which can be done by men or women. Spousal sexual assault also counted. And then sexual assault by women. So when we talk about this, we have to look at the prevailing opinion on sexual assault. Prevailing opinion on rape. And that is the prevailing opinion, and I really have to emphasize the word opinion here, and I'll come back to why in the next slide. But the prevailing opinion is there's three basic motives for rape and why it occurs. The first is the anger. That anger is triggered. So rape occurs because men are angry and they resent women. The second is power. That is, that men have the desire to control and to dominate women. And three, sadistic. That's the ritualized and savage attack. And again, I go back. There's evidence for number 3, where number 3 is, but it's again less than 1% of rapes. But there's evidence for individuals who are sadistic engaging in rape as an act of hurting others for personal arousal. However, these first two, there is little to no evidence to support them. That's why I said 2% or less. It's actually probably less than 2% that are actually due to this, because what we know is it just doesn't fit the actual pattern. Let's look at the next slide and explain that in better detail. So initially, and with those first two, that power, anger, dominance, all of that, what control, all of this came from a person called Susan Brown Miller. Susan Brown Miller published a book in the 70s that basically said that rape is an abuse of power and control in which rapists seek to humiliate, embarrass, shame, degrade, and terrify the victim. The primary objective is to exercise power and control over another person. And what that comes down to is that, and again, I've already said this, that there's importance for reducing rape, so studying it. There's actually been relatively little research on it. Why? Partly because what I said, it's so emotionally charged. People can't get past the naturalistic fallacy, things like that. People believing that those who do research on rape are rapists themselves. People believing that if rape is natural, and when I say natural there, I don't mean good. Rape is something that is natural, meaning it's biological or it occurs in nature, that it must be good, because that's the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something's in nature doesn't mean it's good or bad. Many species that commit acts of rape. Just like many species commit acts of aggression. That doesn't mean aggression is good. We know that. But also, it's been a lot of the neglect on rape has been because feminist scholars of the 1970s said they knew all the answers why men raped. That was because power and dominance and control. And because of that, we don't need to do any more research on it. And like I said, according to Brown Miller, she published it in 1975, rape is a crime of violence, not sex, and it's committed by all men against all women to keep women in their place. I should point out, Brown Miller was not a psychologist. She was not a research scientist. She did no research to get to this. She just basically put forth the feminist views at the time. I'm not going to say feminists are bad. I'm going to say the feminist views at the time were that rape was this instrument that men were using to dominate and control women. And it was used by all men against all women to keep women in their place. And again, when you look at it like this, that's a lot of our, even your book, looks at rape as being about power and dominance, even though there was no research done to make that statement, and all of the research done since then has shown that that was false. It's still something, that a myth that's perpetuated, that really has harmed the basically ability of, and the progress towards reducing rape and sexual assault. So again, why should we be skeptical of this claim? Evolutionary here. You know, I love my evolution. Evolutionary here. That first off, evolutionary things are not selected for on a species level. They're on an individual level. So it's not going to be all men against all women. And even then, it would be something that would only be selected for if it had a benefit. So if rape occurs and continues to occur throughout evolutionary history and continues to occur today, then it must have been selected for in some way, even if there's selections against it as well. And that's one thing I'm not going to get into here. If you took human sexuality, I talk much more about like anti-rape adaptations that women have, and how societal norms and family dynamics and things like that actually reduce rape. And the fact is that rape is against the norms and laws of every society on the planet. That there's definite negatives and drawbacks to it. Even with all those negatives and drawbacks, it still continues to occur. Why does it still continue to occur? Why was it still selected for evolutionarily, even if there was all these things against it? Well, then there must be some reason for it to be selected for. And again, don't fall into the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something's selected for doesn't mean it's a good thing. It's still a bad thing. I throw that caveat over and over again, that I think rape is abhorrent. Rape and sexual assault are horrible things, and we should do everything we can to completely eliminate it from happening. But that being said, there is an evolutionary reason for it. So looking at Brown-Miller's explanation, so her hypothesis predicts that rapists should target older, more powerful women, especially particularly politically powerful women. Why? Because her explanation is it's about power and control. If it's about power and control, then men should be targeting women who have power and control to put them in their place, so to say. The truth is that women over 40 are rarely raped. And this isn't because women over 40 are not targeted by violent crime. If we look at our lines here, the female population is in green, murder victims is in red, and yes, it goes down as women get older. But rape victims is in purple, and you see that the peak of rape victims is in about 22, 23, young 20s, and it really goes down into the 40s, especially into the 60s. So you see here that it's women who are in positions of power aren't the ones being raped. The victims of rape tend to be those who are poor, and as the hypothesis would suggest, this tends to be because women that are poor have less avenues of regress, less avenues of getting back at the rapist. And another observation, and this is one that goes against rape myths that we have, is that many rapes involve physical violence. The actual fact of the matter is that the majority of rape victims report that have very little physical harm, or if they do have physical harm, and I'm not talking about psychological harm here. Again, rape even without physical violence is morally abhorrent, still damaging to women, still psychologically damaging. But the fact is that most women who are raped do not have physical harm, or if they do have physical harm, it's minor physical harm. And actually many women report that after being raped, the rapist is concerned with their health. Why is this the case? Well, if we looked at it from an evolutionary perspective, if the rape is about reproduction, then of course the guy is going to be concerned about the health of the woman, because if she is harmed, if she is hurt, then she is less likely to be able to have the baby that possibly got implanted. This is also, and I'm not getting into it too much here, but one of the anti-rape adaptations women have is for lubrication of the vagina even when they're being raped. So when you see these judges that say, or politicians that say, well, she had lubrication, she must have wanted it. That is completely false. Another huge myth. That lubrication actually occurs in a way so that the female is protected, because if lubrication doesn't occur, damage to their genitals could occur. So the lubrication occurs as a defense mechanism, not because they're into it. I could go on and on. Again, like I said, I'm not human sexuality. I talk about it much more about the defense mechanisms that women have, things like that. I just wanted to kind of hit on them briefly here. And then I always love this thought experiment, not because it's a positive thing, but because it actually is eye-opening. And that is, imagine a young heterosexual couple that are about to have sex. Just prior to having sex, he changes his mind and says, she changes her mind and says no. He then persists and commits date rape. So what's going on here? If Brown-Miller was correct, then as soon as she said no and he persisted, that he then changed from wanting to have sex to now wanting to dominate her, control her, put her in her place. And that's not the case. Prior to her saying no, his motivation was sexual. After she said no, his motivation remained sexual. It's still abhorrent. It's still wrong. It's just, why did it occur? Was he no longer interested in sex? No, he still committed it because sex was the motivation for it. So, contrary to the United Nations, Brown-Miller, many politically correct social scientists, for men, rape may primarily be about sex, at least much of the time. Not all of the time, but much of the time, it is about sex. What are some things to support that? Well, let's look into that for a couple slides real quick. First, rape is actually known in every culture that's been studied. And in all cultures studied, the rapists are punished and or ostracized. So it is a human universal. Because it's a human universal, we can determine that there's a biological cause of it. There's a biological reasoning of it. If there's a biological reasoning, then, and even if it's not 100%, because obviously people can have control over their behaviors. But if there's a biological reasoning, then we can look at it evolutionarily as selected for. So the obvious evolutionary hypothesis is that rape is a strategy that some men use to obtain reproductive benefits. We ask ourselves, though, is this possible? And let's go back to that image we had a few slides ago. And that is this image right here. And when it comes to this, we already talked about how rape victims are right at that peak age of fertility, right in the young 20s. And it really falls off as fertility falls off. And what we know is that some women that are raped do get pregnant. Even in modern societies with access to birth control, as many as 5% of women that are raped get pregnant. That is actually a relatively high number. Men have an apparent preference for fertile victims, not the highest in reproductive value, and they have a preferential for targeting women who have no defense or recourse through the legal systems, like those that are poor or in in war zones. So when it comes down to it, the rapes that occur tend to occur in situations where the guy is less likely to be punished, as well as when the girl is most likely to be fertile. And actually, we know that men tend to target women who are ovulating. Women who are ovulating as a defense mechanism, and I said I took that out, I go into that in human sexuality, but women as a defense mechanism actually tend to, without even realizing it, stay safer, are less willing to take risks when they're ovulating, when they're more likely to get pregnant. So there's an adaptation for men seeking out women who are ovulating, and women who are ovulating seek out protections while they're ovulating. Again, one of those interesting dynamics of adaptation and counter-adaptation. And the final thing I'll just mention is that when marital rape does occur, it tends to, not always, but it tends to, it typically occurs in the context of sperm competition. What is sperm competition? Sperm competition is when there's the possibility that the female, the wife in this case, may have been unfaithful, may be able to get pregnant with someone else's child. When men suspect their wife is unfaithful, they are more likely to commit marital rape. Alright, like I said, negative topic, but it really is something that the more we understand, the better we can go about reducing these types of things. And as I said, I strongly encourage taking like human sexuality. I go into things like love a lot more, but I also go into the negative connotations of sex, such as rape, a lot more. There's an entire lecture on it. Alright, in this set of slides, got a little bit long, but we talked about social psychology, perceiving others, mate preferences, schemas, attributions, conformity, obedience, helping, groups and crowds, social neuroscience, finished up with some aggression, which is very relevant to what's going on, and finally sexual assault. Thanks.